There are few arguments quite as polarised as the one about how we get our energy. Specifically, some people absolutely hate the expansion of wind turbines, others fight just as vociferously in their defence. Well, they're being installed in high volume in many countries, so let's have a look and see if we can make sense of the claims and the counterclaims. I step into this because I'm interested in grey areas where there's vigorous debate. And I guess it's a natural thing that people become emotionally attached to a form of electricity generation. I mean, it must be, because it seems to happen rather a lot. I am not one of those people. Getting reliable, affordable and clean energy seems to me to be, a practical problem that needs to be solved based on what works. Up until a couple of years ago, maybe in certain countries still today, the argument around wind turbines was a proxy war between those who supported action on climate change and those who didn't. So the debate was between the pros and the cons of wind farms versus the pros and the cons of fossil fuel generation. In growing numbers of countries now, whether you're happy about it or not, that's no longer where the discussion is, because they've committed themselves to making the shift over coming decades to zero carbon forms of energy. And it's a big shift. For people who think it can be done almost instantly, completely underestimate the scale of the change that's going on. You can see it underway already in the UK, with an overall 73% increase specifically in wind generation between 2016 and 2019. So the discussion moves to whether we're making pragmatic, well-planned and rational choices, or whether we're being influenced by ideology, with the result that we could make things worse, not better. Because, big shifts are a time of significant risk. You're taking a big, complex system that is flawed, but works, and you're making major changes to fix those flaws, but in so doing, you don't want it to stop working. And let's be clear, all energy sources have advantages and disadvantages. There's no single silver bullet, not that we've discovered to date anyway. The best likely outcome almost certainly involves a degree of mix and match, covering the downsides of one form with the advantages of another. The benefit of fossil fuel power plants was that they were extremely power dense. In other words, the amount of land that was taken out of any other use, from the oil wells to the coal mines to the power plants themselves, in order to generate the electricity, was extremely low for the amount of power that was actually provided. That's how Vaclav Smil defined power density, not to be confused with energy density. This paper by Van Zalk and Behrens 2018 produced power density figures for different energy sources in the United States, expressed in terms of electrical power produced per metre squared of land. It found the power density of renewable and non-renewable systems densities differ by 3 orders of magnitude, which is a huge difference. Median power density for coal-fired power plants was 135.1 watts per metre squared. Natural gas has the highest power density at 482.1 watts per metre squared. Nuclear power, the most power-dense low-carbon energy source, sits in the middle of those at 240.8 watts per metre squared. The fossil fuel plants had the advantage they could be brought online or taken offline relatively easily, so matching supply to demand was pretty straightforward. But of course, they created pollution, and they've been one of the main engines, increasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, so we have collectively decided to move on. Campaigners may demonise fossil fuels, but if you look at what they enabled us to achieve throughout history, it's my view, as I've said on here before, we should be waving them a fond and grateful farewell, notwithstanding the problems we now need to solve. Because we're going to miss those advantages. All renewable energy forms are significantly less power dense, so are going to require large areas of land or ocean to be dedicated to them. In that 2018 paper, the comparison power density for wind in the US was 1.84 watts per square metre, And of course, averages hold all sorts of things. Within that median figure, you have lots of variability because you can get onshore turbines and offshore turbines. Some wind farm sightings can allow other uses on the ground between the turbines, some not. Some locations are more reliable for frequent, strong winds than others. Modern turbines are more efficient and have higher generation capacity than older ones. All sorts of variability. But even so, it's a huge difference. But of course, power density isn't the only relevant factor. You have to be able to accommodate the land requirement for sure, but some of the benefits may justify those sources that require more land than the old fossil fuel versions did. So, what are the arguments when people are debating the pros and the cons? Well, let's start with the pros side. 1. Right now, wind power is cost effective in most markets. It wasn't so in the early days, but as turbines are being produced and placed at scale, the expected reduction of the unit price has come down. This, more than anything, is what is fueling, for instance, the UK government's appetite for maximising the role that wind plays in providing energy for its electricity grid. In a report published in 2020, the government said that renewables were turning out to be significantly cheaper than its previous estimate 4 years earlier, which had already reduced the cost by 30%. The website Carbon Brief said that in 2013, the government had calculated the cost for electricity from an offshore wind farm to be £140 per megawatt hour. The current estimate puts it instead at just £57 per megawatt hour. This graph shows how the relative costs of different energy forms have been revised, and that process is expected to continue into the future, with the cost of offshore wind particularly falling, and with gas, because of the increasing cost of carbon, steadily rising. You'll see nuclear falling short term there as well, a subject for another video maybe. Now, that's not the whole story when it comes to costs, and we'll come to that later. Number 2 on the list of pros. It doesn't create pollution in operation. The fossil fuel plants produce particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, which can cause human health problems. And then, of course, there's the carbon emissions contributing to climate change, global warming. And that's all you need to say about that. It's kind of obvious. Number 3, if you live in a country with abundant wind, then you're tapping into a fuel that carries zero cost. However much you use, it never gets used up. And particularly for countries like the UK, which is in the mid-latitudes, the power density of solar farms is significantly reduced there because they get less energy per square metre directly from the sun, both because of the curve of the Earth, but also because of the higher incidence of cloud cover. Number 4. Wind turbines can be local energy, can be built on existing farms or, like the 4 close to my village, on a business park. They can be efficient converters of energy. Over 60% of the energy in coal is lost as waste heat. The energy efficiency of turbines can be up to 95%, and the energy can be used relatively locally, reducing transmission losses. I believe that the turbines close to me pay a significant contribution to the local authority as part of the deal that got them the planning permission, so there's a benefit there. And of course, some people think they look majestic, or at least, aesthetically pleasing. Of course, there are other people, and we'll come to those in a moment. Then finally, on the list of pros, number 5, they can represent indigenous primary energy production in countries that otherwise would have to import energy, which means they can benefit a country's balance of trade and reduce its geopolitical risk from supply disruption. So, all of that sounds great, but of course there are a bunch of downsides as well. Let's go through those. 1. Intermittency. It's all very well, the energy conversion being better than that of coal, but the point is that coal is a highly dense, stored energy. The benefit of stored energy is that you can release that energy on demand. Wind power flows freely when the wind is blowing, and it doesn't get generated at all when it isn't. That means that you need additional infrastructure to cope with the downtime, which needs some mode of storage. either battery storage or conversion to hydrogen. Now, conversion to hydrogen gives you a power-dense material that can be transported to where it's needed. Very, very useful. But that conversion process is anything but energy efficient, as I covered in a previous video about hydrogen. And we're now starting to see that the challenge of intermittency is starting to make itself felt. The UK's electricity grid operator, National Grid, said that consumers would be paying for significantly more backup power stations next winter because many plants are expected to renege on contracts designed to keep the lights on. The government has a capacity market scheme, which is supposed to offset the instability of the increased wind and solar power. It aims to ensure that there are enough backup plants to meet demand even when it's dark and there's no wind. But some of the plants this winter simply didn't deliver what they'd been contracted to, and there have been repeated supply crunches over recent months. Now, so far, those have been headaches for the national grid operators, moments of extremely expensive energy generation, but it hasn't resulted in the lights going off. So most people aren't aware that it's been a problem. The backup plants haven't been delivering for a number of reasons, and it can be because of safety shutdowns, owners going into administration, plants shutting down completely, or new plants having construction delays. The government's decided to buy an additional 2 gigawatts of energy above what it had planned. That, of course, is arguably the unseen and hidden cost of the variable energy sources. As discussed previously on this channel, Germany is committing to its gas pipeline from Russia, Nord Stream 2, precisely because its decision to close nuclear power plants has left it vulnerable to its resultant higher percentage of variable power sources. So that's another case in point. Mind you, given the polarisation, you have to be careful about what information you trust. In the week that this video was shot, Texas was gripped by a highly unusual cold spell, with ice storms and -10 and below temperatures. That's when you really need to be able to heat your home, obviously. Unfortunately, the system struggled. There were power outages affecting millions of people, and more were asked to moderate their power use so that the system could at least barely cope. One of the things that happened was that about 20% of the state's wind turbines froze solid, leading this photo to go viral with a suggestion that it was predominantly responsible for the problems. And here was a photo of a fossil-fueled powered helicopter trying to sort it out. Well, you know, you always need to check these sorts of things. And of course, this photo doesn't come from Texas at all. As it happened, the shortage came about from multiple failures, but the majority from gas-fired power plants and nuclear power plants whose water intakes froze. Although the wind farms had around 20% non-functional turbines, the hit from those was significantly smaller from the others. So the people that leapt in early to make a political point were left with egg on their face. As indeed were those who'd previously engaged in political point scoring when California power systems had outages during the wildfires, a fact that Senator Ted Cruz admitted himself. The moral of the story: these things are practical problems to be solved. They don't care about your ideology, they don't care about your politics. Oh, and by the way, most wind turbines in areas that see freezing weather regularly now have self-de-icing systems. Nobody much thought that was going to be necessary for those sited in Texas, of course. They might have changed their mind on that one. The mixed messages of Texas are one thing, but it doesn't get away from the genuine difficulties that a number of countries are facing with the growth of wind intermittent power. So it's clearly not enough to say this is now cheaper than the alternatives. Let's pile as much of it as possible onto the grid as we can, because that's how we're going to get cheaper energy. There must be a maximum advisable percentage of the power you should be getting from those sources. People will debate what that should be. And that brings us to point 2 in the cons list. 2, the true cost is higher than what is stated, because you have to cope with that intermittency. Earlier I quoted the government report showing that per power plant, wind and solar generate energy significantly cheaper than the alternatives. The same report produced estimates of what it described as enhanced costs. And that was the first attempt to factor in the additional cost of measures to cope with intermittency. Bearing in mind, this was before the recent announcement about needing to have additional capacity. So those costs have gone up in the meantime. Nevertheless, the government came up with this. The graph shows blue diamonds representing whole system costs for each of 6 scenarios, because there's more than one way you can go about coping with intermittency. The outcome is that it significantly levels the cost between the different energy forms. So it erodes some of those perceived advantages for wind. It doesn't necessarily make it the wrong choice, but it means you should operate on the basis of the real cost. And it means you should budget and build that offsetting capacity as you're building in new wind generation. Right now, that seems to be the bit where we have a failure point. Then the third on the list of cons is the impact of wind turbines on bird and bat populations. As you would expect, birds and bats do not enjoy the experience if a quickly spinning massive blade suddenly appears in front of the space that they're flying into. And where this debate is at its most polarised, this is the area that the critics are most drawn to. Because the environmentalists who support wind power, they're, supposed to be in favour of nature, yeah? So being able to use that principle against them has an irony that appeals to people that are scoring points. And the result of that has been less than illuminating. Wind power defenders have at certain points gone to great lengths to downplay the impact on birds, in some cases even covering up evidence. And for some of those on the attack, suddenly the well-being of birds becomes an absolutely crucial issue. For some, certainly not for all, but for some, it's kind of the first time they've shown any interest in the welfare of wildlife. When statistics are weaponised in the most polarised debates, it can be hard to get data that you can fully trust. For instance, one author claimed that although it was true that wind turbines killed, some birds, this was a trivial number compared to the number killed by other energy sources. Benjamin Sovacool said wind farms killed approximately 7,000 birds in the United States in 2006, but nuclear plants killed about 327,000 and fossil fuel power plants 14.5 million. Now, that is a remarkable claim. If power plants are killing 14.5 million birds in the US, that's bird genocide. So, I looked at the 2012 study where he makes this claim and found that it was based on factoring in an estimate of the impact of climate change on birds globally. Now, I'm sorry, I fully recognise the seriousness of climate change, and as my regular viewers will know, supporting decarbonising action is something that I do, but that is a fundamentally dishonest sleight of hand to wave away a genuine problem because it's an obstacle to your favoured technology. You don't solve problems by pretending they don't exist. But the fact that wind turbines are now being built at scale, to some extent that has reduced the defensiveness of some of their champions. So in a recent event on redesigning wind energy for the next era, conservationists and champions of wind power acknowledged the issue as an important one. Here's a write-up of part of that discussion on the Power Technology website. A recurring theme of the webinar was the conservation issues that wind farm operators are working to tackle. Maria de Jesus Fernandez of the National Institute for Nature and Forest Conservation brought forward in particular the issue of wind farms still killing a great quantity of birds and eliminating whole mammal generations due to wind blades' capability to hurt or kill species even when not rotating. Fernandez emphasised how advanced conservation efforts are needed to effectively reduce the impact that farms have on birds and bats. For this reason, conducting environmental impact assessments, EIAs, prior to placing new farms has a fundamental role in protecting animal species already at risk of disappearing. And that's because it can make a huge difference where the wind farms are sited. If you stick one in the path of a major bird migration route, you are going to get carnage. K. Sean Smallwood in the paper Comparing Bird and Bat Fatality Rate Estimates Among North American Wind Energy Projects 2013 estimated 573,000 bird fatalities per year and 888,000 bat fatalities due to wind energy capacity in the US in 2012. An alternative estimate by Hayes estimated 600,000 bat fatalities. Either way, significant numbers. This paper, Wind Turbines Cause Functional Habitat Loss for Migratory Soaring Birds, looked at the displacement effect of wind turbines on black kites tracked by GPS. They found that the impact of turbines on soaring birds was greater than they'd previously thought. In addition to the commonly reported fatalities, the avoidance of turbines by soaring birds causes habitat losses in their movement corridors. Authorities should recognise this further impact of wind energy production and establish new regulations that protect soaring habitat. And since it's a significant problem, various people are trying to work out how to solve it. This study, Effects of Wind Turbine Curtailment on Bird and Bat Fatalities by Smallwood and Bell 2020, looked at attempts to reduce bat and bird fatalities with operational curtailment, which is a fancy way of saying sometimes turning the turbines off. They looked at two wind projects, where one operated continuously and the other was shut down during the peak bird migration period in the autumn or the fall, if you're in America. It found that curtailment significantly reduced fatalities of bats, but made no difference to the fatalities of birds. It concluded, because the migration season is relatively brief, seasonal curtailment would greatly reduce bat fatalities for a slight loss in annual energy generation, but it might not benefit many bird species. Needless to say, energy companies are not wild about a strategy that involves shutting down energy generation, especially if it doesn't make a comprehensive difference. One new technology that's been developed and was trialled successfully over the last couple of years is a thing called Identiflight. It detects and identifies eagles that are flying on a collision course and shuts down the wind turbine long enough for it to pass. A study published this year by McClure et al. Showed that the system resulted in an 82% reduction in eagle fatalities. That's good for the larger birds, but there are some improvements as well for other birds that are coming to light. This study by May in 2020 showed that simply painting one of the turbine blades black, so making them more visible to birds, reduced fatalities for a range of birds with an overall reduction of around 70%. And that's where things stand at the moment. All of this work does suggest that it's a problem that, while it may not be solvable per se, can at least have its impact significantly reduced. Fourth and final on my list of cons is the impact on and the response of the communities where wind farms are sited. There are various communities that have fought bitterly against plans to put wind farms next to them. In Germany, its ambitious programme of energy transformation led to a sizable backlash that hindered the project's progress. Der Spiegel said in 2019, "The politicians fear citizen resistance. There is hardly a wind energy project that is not fought." Indeed, over 660 active citizen initiatives were counted as opposing local wind developments. This is one reason why countries like the UK, where they have the available sites, are embracing offshore wind, which avoids all of those sorts of kickbacks. All of us want energy. Few of us want to live next door to the thing that generates it. And that holds mostly true regardless of the source. Now, with the large, heavily centralised generation, whether coal or gas or nuclear, only a tiny proportion of people have to live in close proximity compared to the population served. With wind or solar, not the case. And as I said earlier, some people find wind turbines to be graceful and majestic, but a significant proportion of others find them intrusive and a blot on the landscape. And they also complain about the impacts of noise from wind generation, complaints that have had sufficient support from a number of academic studies into the health effects of noise to lead the World Health Organization to include wind turbines on its European noise guidelines. The citizens who tend to be most successful in fighting off proposed projects are, of course, the well-off, the well-educated and influential communities. In 2009, Business Week described something they called the Starbucks rule for siting wind farms. In other words, make sure you're at least 30 miles away from the nearest Starbucks to avoid the sort of people that are going to be likely to block your project. Now, you might sneer at those people, dismiss them all as NIMBYs, but it does underline that for many countries, the suitable locations where wind farms can be built that don't seriously create opposition and resistance are limited. That is a limiting factor for the sort of large-scale national programme that people advocate for, as Germany has found to its cost. So there you have a list of pros and cons. The passionate campaigners on each side will embrace their half of the equation while contemptuously swatting away the other half. Probably telling me in the comments below of all of the half a dozen additional items that I missed on each side of the equation. Why do people get so passionate about this? And I don't mean the ones who look at the data and the facts and come to a conclusion about what they think will work best. I mean the people for whom there is no argument, no debate to be had. Well, perhaps because on the environmentalist side, people have historically championed these solutions and old habits die hard. Because they view energy from the wind and the sun as natural and therefore good. Some would say that coal is natural as well, of course. And because they have a romanticism attached to the sight of wind turbines with their link to an idealised past, which is understandable but in no way should be a factor in making pragmatic decisions on the stable provision of electricity. On the other side, perhaps because people don't like change, particularly highly visible in your face change, they react against moves to impose it on them when the old system, suited them just fine, thank you very much. It's worth remembering that in the 1920s and 1930s, many felt the same about the network of electricity pylons that were being placed across the countryside, without which we wouldn't even have a national grid. Nobody now campaigns for existing pylons to be removed. It's the process of change that's always the main motivating factor. But I'm guessing about all of that. I'm not a mind reader. Whatever drives their passions, the campaigners focused on one answer and one answer only should not be allowed to drive this. Changing the nature of power supply has to be done carefully, with a view to stability and reliability, particularly when the weather's at its worst, even in places like Texas, where such things might happen only extremely rarely. There's no reason why wind power shouldn't be part of the mix. It has certain positive features, it's still cost competitive up to a point, but it has to be seen as coming hand in hand with the measures to mitigate its intermittency, and that needs to be built into the cost equations. If enthusiasm for it keeps running ahead of those practicalities, then we'll all be spending time sitting in the dark, wondering how we could have been so stupid.